Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the October Lunch and Learn here at the Harmon Museum. I'm John Zimkus, the Education Director and Historian. Thank you for being with us. There's a lot of things going on in the Historical Society coming up in the weeks ahead. This Saturday, we'll have a Black Bag Bingo, which is a fundraiser for the Lebanon Boosters and also for the Harmon Museum. There are some tickets left for that. On October 18th and 19th and 25th and 26th, there is the Ghost Walk. I understand the first week is the 18th and 19th is already sold out, but the 25th and 26th, there are still some tickets. It's a walk through town to talking about some of the residents who, although they've departed, they haven't departed. So take advantage of that. The Beetle Cabin, our 1795 cabin, will be open on October 26th between the hours of 1 and 3, when Lebanon does have its business trick-or-treat for the young children for Halloween. So if you have some youngsters in your family, invite them to come over here during that trick-or-treat time on Saturday the 26th between 1 and 3. Our flea market will be taking place here at the Conference Center on Friday, November 1st and Saturday, November 2nd. It's free, but there's always some great bargains. If you have something that you would like to donate to be sold, let us know, and we'll make arrangements for that. So the flea market is always a very popular thing. On November 9th, the Lebanon Library and Boone's Craft Museum, Bing Schott Museum, in Dayton, will have a planetarium here in the Conference Center between the hours of 10 and 3. For more information on that, contact the Lebanon Public Library. We will have another Black Bag Bingo on November 16th. As far as Lunch and Learns go, next month, which will be on the 20th of November, we are going to have the Military Women's Memorial. Retired Air Force Colonel Judy Person will be speaking. Writing about her presentation, she says, "Our country has one major national memorial that was built to honor and preserve the stories of the women who have defended our freedom from the Revolutionary War to today. The Military Women's Memorial is a hidden gem located in the ceremonial entrance to Arlington National Cemetery. This presentation will look at the history of the memorial, take a tour inside, weave the story of how America came to have an unknown soldier, and lastly, talk about why it's important we preserve the stories of the women who contributed to the freedom of America." It's going to be a fascinating presentation. Less than a week after the Veterans Day, it is something I think you'll enjoy. That will be on November 20th. On December 18th, Lunch and Learn will be a Christmas concert from the Bones of Cincinnati. Trombone players extraordinaire, they will be here. There'll be no need for a microphone. You'll hear them. It'll be enjoyable, and hopefully you will be able to attend. On January 15th, our good friend Fred Compton will be here. As you may know, Fred worked at the Golden Lamb for over 30 years, has one of the finest collections of Golden Lamb memorabilia. And his talk will be 3 Centuries of the Golden Lamb 2.0. He's done that title before, but he has more things to share, and that will be very, very enjoyable. Come February 18th, our good friend, once again, Linda Martin, she will be here talking about Valentine's Day decorations. If you are not familiar with Linda, we first met her 3 or 4 years ago with a fantastic 100-year plus collection of Halloween things. And then there was followed by Christmas decorations, and then Easter decorations, and lo and behold, she has Valentine's Day decorations. So there are a lot of neat things we'll see then, and that'll be one I think you'll enjoy also. As I mentioned, there is a discount at the Harmon Museum as a gift shop, and we have some interesting things we have added to that. One of them is the folklore series. Some 60, 70 years ago, Hazel Spencer Phillips, the founding matron of the Harmon Museum, then known as the Warren County Historical Society, wrote many of these and edited great little folklore tales. And they've been reproduced for the first time in over 50 years. And it's part of a series, and they are being sold for $2.50. Something else which is being sold there is something I am very, very proud of. I wrote it. It is, a lot of people think of, when they think of airships and airship disasters, the first thing that comes to mind is what? The Hindenburg. Some 35 people in the airship, and one person on the land died in that. But that is not the greatest airship disaster the world has ever seen. The greatest airship disaster actually took place 4 years earlier, also near New Jersey, and it was the USS Akron blowing up in April of 1933. The little booklet, which has a lot of photographs in it, is called The World's Greatest Airship Disaster and Me. One of the people who died on the Akron was my uncle, the person I'm named after. His name was Joseph John Zimkus. I'm John Joseph Zimkus. It's $5. You'll enjoy the pictures. You'll see some of my family members in here, but also some fascinating facts about what happened that day. And some 73 or more people did die in that disaster. One of them was my uncle. But one of the survivors was with him when it went down. And so we have some first-hand accounts as to what my Uncle Joe did when the Akron was in trouble. So I think you'll enjoy that. So enjoy your meal, fill out your quiz, sign your name on the paper, and in about 15, 20 minutes, we'll have our speaker. Thank you. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, once again to the Harmon Museum's Lunch and Learn for October, and a good afternoon to you. Our speaker today is Tanya Mitchell. Her short fiction has appeared in various journals and anthologies, including the Copperfield Review, Echoes, Glimmer, and other stories and poems. And also, she has won the Cinnamon Press Award for fiction. When she landed on the story of 1887 of Nellie Bly, 10 Harrowing Days in a Women's Insane Asylum, she knew it was a novel she had to write. Nellie Bly is a fascinating person, a real person, and I think some of you may be familiar with some of her life, but Tanya has taken this very important aspect of her life and turned it into historical fiction. The novel A Feigned Madness won the Reader's View Reviewer's Choice Award and the Kopp's Featherling International Book Award. She's has a second novel, The Arsenic Eater's Wife, about 1889 story in Liverpool, England, as I understand it. She's a member of the Historical Novel Society and the Women's Fiction Writers Association. She lives in Cincinnati with her husband, 3 boys, and an overweight golden doodle. There is a connection which I let Tanya know about a couple weeks ago between William Elmer Harmon, our namesake here at the Harmon Museum, and Nellie Bly. As some of you may know, Harmon became a millionaire in real estate. Born in Lebanon, but had his main office for years in New York. In 1921, He used his great-grandfather's name, Jedediah Tingle. That name sort of sounds like it belongs in a Charles Dickens novel. But Jedediah Tingle was his great-grandfather, lived on State Route 123, built a stone house, which still exists there. But he dies in the mid-19th century. But in 1921, Jedediah Tingle is writing letters to people. And he is being very frank, sometimes offering congratulations, sometimes sort of chastising that person. Sometimes it is the cop on the beat who saved a little girl's life in a traffic incident. Or sometimes he writes and gives money, as he did with Helen Keller. And he also did with Nellie Bly in 1921 for an organization known as the American Seamen's Association. And I had a rough time trying to figure out what that association was. But Tanya has informed me. She has done her diligent research in the last couple of weeks, and she will let you know what that association was. In the letter that she wrote back to Jedediah, he gave her $5, but she does say, I think that will be able to feed 25 former sailors for a full day with that $25 in 1921. So it's nice to have a connection there. By the way, after Harmon's death, the New York Times revealed who Jedediah Tingle was. So it was a week or two after his death that the New York Times did that. Well, without further ado, Tanya Mitchell and the fascinating story of Nellie Bly.
Thank you all. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm really glad to be here today. I have never been to the Harmon Museum ever, and I walked in this morning and I was like, wow, this place is great. You have a cabin from the 1700s on your, I didn't know that. So I'm very pleased to be here. You have an excellent facility. I have been to Lebanon many times, and as you know or can guess, probably I've been to the Golden Lamb many times, because if you come to Lebanon, you have to try it at least once, right? And I've also been to Mulberry Street Books, up the street and over like a block maybe, to the used bookstore there, because Angela, the owner, every quarter does her Girls' Night Out, where she invites local authors in to sell and sign books. So I'm usually up here at least 4 times a year, unless I have some sort of contradiction on my calendar. So I love Lebanon. And when John called and said, hey, would you like to do a presentation on Nellie Bly, I was really happy to accept and be here. So what I'm going to do is talk about her extraordinary life, and she did have a very extraordinary life. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote about her, and then we're going to get the quiz results to see who won the free book. And then if we have time, we're going to do a Q&A. Does that sound good? Okay. Also, fair warning, I have never used a smartboard before, so this is really cool. So let's hope that I don't screw anything up. So why are we going to talk about Nellie Bly? Why her? Nellie Bly was not from this area. She wasn't even from Ohio. She wasn't even from the Midwest. Well, the reasons, there are 2. I did it, yay. Okay, so why Nellie Bly? For a woman who started out very young doing the things that she was doing, she did an amazing amount of things before she died. And she wasn't very old when she died. She was only 57. So these are just some of the things that she was known for. She was an investigative journalist, a patent inventor. She was a novelist, a muckraker, a war correspondent, a wife and widow, and there's more things I could have put on that board. But trust me, she got up to a lot. And when I say her period, I'm talking about the period between when she was doing things in public that she was known for, about the mid-1880s through the early 1920s before she died. So that wasn't all that long ago, but when you consider that she was very young when she was doing them and she was a woman, they were truly some groundbreaking things. So the second reason, and you stole a little bit of my thunder about no, that's all right, I'm just kidding. You do have, she does have ties to this museum in the way of a letter, and I'm going to show that letter and read it, and then we're going to talk about what it's about. Because when John sent it to me a couple weeks ago, I'm like, I don't have any idea what Jedediah Tingle was talking about. Like, I got to figure this out. And so I did some digging, and now I know. So, okay, so who was Nellie Bly? Oh, before I get started on this from the jump, I just want to say much of what I'm going to take and talk to you about is from a biography on her written by Brooke Kruger that I used. This thing weighs about 3 pounds. It's 600 pages, lots and lots of photographs. It is by far the best biography on Nellie Bly. So if you are the kind of person that's interested in this and you like to read biographies, I highly recommend this book. The other information, if you just want to fill in some of the holes today, because I'm not going to be going over everything in her life, there's way too much and I'd be here too long, you can get from my website at tanyamitchellauthor.com. So I'm going to pass this around. It's my dog-eared copy. I used it for notes, but you're welcome to pass that around. Okay, so why Nellie Bly? I did it again. All right, so who was she? Let's see. She was born Elizabeth Cochran in 1864 in Pennsylvania, and she came from a wealthy family. Her father, Michael Cochran, had real estate and owned a mill in a small town named after him called Cochran's Mill. He was also a judge and a justice of the peace. So a lot of people knew who he was. He was quite well known. So there were many plot twists in Nellie's life. Many plot twists. And so at least what I like to refer to as plot twists. And the first one came when she was just 6 years old because her father suddenly died of a mysterious illness. And we don't really know what that illness was. All we know is he got dizzy one day, he came home from work, he got into bed, and he never got out again, and he died. So she was only 6 years old. And her family at this time is her mother, Nellie, 2 older brothers, and 2 younger siblings. She had a younger sister and a younger brother. So this is a very young family, and his death put them into financial straits. So if the family is wealthy, you're probably wondering, well, why financial straits? Well, her father, Michael Cochran, had been married before. He'd been married for a good number of years. His wife had died, and then he had remarried Nellie's mother. Well, that first marriage yielded 10 children. Yeah. And then he had 5 more in his second marriage. So they were busy. He had 15 children. So his money got first divided up between those 10 adult children. So much of that money went to his other heirs. Mary Jane got her portion, being the widow, and then the rest was put up for the remaining siblings, Nellie and her 4 other siblings, in a trust that they would get once they came of age. Let's see. So before I go on and mention this last point, I just want to say that building to the right there was the family home in Apollo, Pennsylvania, which is a really small, very charming town, somewhat like this one. I wanted to get an idea of how big her house was. It still stands. That was her family home that she had, but she lived in relative wealth with her family. I was a little disappointed because it's not exactly seedy, but it's now been, because it was 10,000 square feet in its day, it's now been divided into all these tiny little apartments, and it needs some work done. But I did take a picture of the historical marker out in front of her house. So that was a little bit disappointing. So along the lines of disappointing, her mother would remarry 2 years later, and she ended up marrying a man that could not have been more different than her first husband. His name was Jack Ford, and he was an abusive drunk. She didn't know him very well. They were married 6 years, but it finally ended in divorce because with all the drunken bouts, the physical abuse, and disappearances, because he would leave for some time, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. They didn't know where he was, and then he'd come back and he'd be drunk and he'd be abusive. It finally ended in divorce. So I just want to mention this because I think it keys into who Nellie Bly was from an early age. She would testify in court on behalf of her mother, talking about the abuse and the language that he used when he talked about them and her mother. So she was 12 when she did this. So this was a lot of heavy things hitting her between her father's death and then this stepfather who wasn't a very good one. So by this time, Nellie wanted out of Little Apollo, Pennsylvania. And the thing she decided that she wanted to do was to become a teacher. So she went to what was called a normal school. Have you ever heard of normal schools before? Okay. Yeah, so these were schools, the name is just weird to me. Like, aren't they all supposed to be normal, you know? But anyway, normal schools were, among other things, ways that ladies could go and learn how to be a teacher. And in that day, it took about 3 years to be certified. And so she's decided at 14, this is what she wants to do. She wants to be a teacher. So here comes another plot twist. Do you remember that trust that I talked about that she was going to inherit when she came of age? Okay. So her manager assured her, and when I say manager, I mean her court-appointed guardian, assured her that there was enough money for her to go to school all 3 years. She ended up dropping out after the first term because the money was gone. And when I say gone, she never saw any of it, and either did any of her siblings. And it really plunged her into just a very depressing time because that's what she wanted to do, and she wasn't going to be able to do it because they didn't have enough money. So it's very unfortunate. So by age 14, she had learned that she needed to depend on herself because 3 things have already happened. Her father's lack of provision, he had the audacity to die, right, without leaving a will. Her stepfather's abuse, which she endured for 6 years, and her guardian's mismanagement. And so at a tender young age, a hardened self-reliance took shape. And this is why when you look back at her life and you see how she had so much grit and so much integrity and so much dogged determination, this is when I think that it started, because all of these things happened early in her life and she needed to move on and get beyond it. So, a new beginning. Mary Jane, her mother, moved her family to Pittsburgh for a fresh start. We don't know a lot. Oh, are you from Pittsburgh? I saw the little. By the way, since you're from Pittsburgh, the masthead of Pittsburgh Dispatch, notice anything strange about that? The Pittsburgh Dispatch, notice anything weird about that? It doesn't have an H after it. Isn't that weird? Pittsburgh didn't have an H after its name until some years after this. I thought that was just, anyway, really, really weird. So she moved the family to Pittsburgh. We don't know what happened those first couple of years, but we do know that eventually Mary Jane would buy and run a boarding house. And Nellie and her younger sister helped her manage the boarding house. But here comes another plot twist. When Nellie Bly turned 20, a change unfolded that would change the course of her life. It happened when she was reading the Pittsburgh Dispatch, one of the larger daily newspapers of the day. She stumbled on a story called Women's Sphere by columnist Erasmus Wilson, and he's pictured there on the left. He was known as the Quiet Observer because his column was named the Quiet Observer, and he was sort of this older country gentleman that liked to talk about the good old days. And so that story in his column, Women's Sphere, was about one thing, and it was about how a women's place was in the home. And only in the home. And so Nellie read this, and she was absolutely infuriated because she didn't get to stay at home. Not every woman got to stay at home. They had to work because things had happened in their lives, like what had happened to her. She also thought, well, what about the women who could stay home, but they don't want to stay home? What if they want a job? What if they want a career? You know, what if they don't want to be married and have children? So she wrote this letter, and the way that it's presented in Brooke's book, it felt to me like she penned this letter and there was steam coming out of her ears because she was so angry about it. She signed the letter, Lonely Orphan Girl. I don't know why she used that name because she was neither lonely nor an orphan at the time that she wrote the letter, but that's what she went with. Well, the managing editor, and he's illustrated there on the right, George Madden, was so impressed, he invited her to appear in the newspaper's office. So Madden, with a little background, was looking to add something fresh to the Sunday edition, and he thought, well, you know, Erasmus is kind of like old school. Maybe we need a little bit of modernity. Maybe she can work. So we'll see. So he asked her to craft replies to the male reader who had prompted Erasmus Wilson's column in the first place, and she did so with such skill. She convinced Madden to hire her. Now, She's only 20. She's never had any journalism training. She never really thought she was going to be a writer. But I mean, this is a big step for her to be able to do something like this and to be able to communicate with enough clarity that an editor would say, okay, yeah, you can write for our paper. We think maybe this could work. So she did this at a time when it was very unusual for women to be in journalism. And if they were, they had to use a pen name. Why?
So they wouldn't know it was a woman.
They wanted their anonymity, not so much the women necessarily, but the men, because they thought that reporting at that time was almost disreputable, even vulgar. And so they thought, well, let's protect their anonymity, and not disclose them, and let's preserve their reputations and things like that. Personally, I don't think she would have cared if she went with her real name, because she was just a very honest person. The name that he chose was Nellie Bly. She would go on to use that for nearly 4 decades. Now, he chose the name because the name had been used previously before for something. Does anybody know where the name Nellie Bly came from?
Was it the theater?
No.
An airplane, I think.
Came after. It was a song by Stephen Foster, who was a very famous composer in Pennsylvania. Does it ring a bell now? Okay, so the song, interestingly enough, was about a Negro slave girl. So she was not that, but I guess he liked the song enough that he wanted to name her after that. So that's the name that she stuck with. So next slide. The girl puzzle. So Madden immediately assigned her to the women's pages. So think fashion, think town gossip. If you're lucky, maybe a little art and theater if you have that in your town. Bazaars, recipes, things like that. She absolutely hated it. Not because she didn't like writing about those things, but because she didn't only want to write about those things. He wanted to keep her within the confines of the ladies' pages because that's where ladies belonged. And she had a problem with it. And so what she would do, and Brooke lays this out just perfectly, she would go in and she would spar with him almost every day about the stories that she wanted most to write about. And in days of, I guess, weakness, she would literally wear him down, and he'd say, okay, just go write the story. And then she'd scramble out of the office and come back in a day or two, having conducted, interviews and done her research, and she'd come out with a story. So what did she write about? The plight of young women forced to work at low-paying or health-imperiling jobs, divorce reform to prevent drunkards and ne'er-do-wells from marrying unless they disclose their past. Wonder where she got that idea. Sketches of the female working poor. So her readers were women who knew that Bly understood who they were, and they loved her. And guess what happened? Fan mail starts coming in, and she's very, very happy. Madden, strangely, wasn't always happy about her fan mail because he was very neat, and he would always just kind of shove it at her and say, here, do something with this. But he also knew that it meant people were reading his paper. And so what he did is award her a column, and she's only 20 years old. And the column would have her byline. Does everybody know what a byline is? It's literally, by Nellie Bly. So everybody knew who she was now because she's now been disclosed as Nellie Bly. And she would end up working for the Dispatch for another year. And then she decided that she wanted to be a correspondent for the Dispatch in Mexico. And so she went down to Mexico for 6 months. It was her idea. She ended up coming back a little earlier. There's a huge story there that I really wish I could go into, but I don't have time. But yeah, she comes back from Mexico. And because she knows she's going to be facing Madden again, and she doesn't want to argue with him every day because she knows she's going to be put on the women's pages, and she won't have it. She just doesn't want it. She decides to leave. It was just time for her to move on. So Bly took off for New York City in 1887, working as a correspondent for the Dispatch. And now she's supporting not only herself, but her mother. So her mother ended up going with her. She wanted to work for a New York paper. And so while she's corresponding and doing stories for the Dispatch, she's going one by one to every newspaper and saying, hi, I'm Nellie Bly. You need to hire me. I have a column in Pittsburgh and loyal readers. Despite all of that, They were like, nope, we don't want to hire you. We're done. We either don't have females on staff and we don't want a woman, or we just, you know, it doesn't matter to us. We're just not, you know, interested at all. So here comes another plot twist, right? So it was when she left her purse on an elevated train that carried the last of her savings in it that she became desperate. So she's got her reticule on the elevated train, her purse. It was not stolen from her. She was always very honest about this. She literally left and realized that she had left it on the train and it had the last of her money in it. And remember, she's supporting not only herself, but her mother. And she was absolutely desperate. She did not want to go back to Pittsburgh because she felt like it would look like she was a failure. And she didn't want to go back because she thought, you know, it would appear as if she was coming back with her tail between her legs. And she didn't want that. So in typical Nellie Bly fashion, she got creative. She walked into the World. The World was the largest newspaper in the United States at the time. It was also the largest newspaper in the world. It was bigger than the Times, the Tribune, the Herald, and the Sun. The picture on the left is taken from when the World was rebuilt by Joseph Pulitzer, the publisher who owned it. It was 15 stories, including the Golden Dome on the top. 15 stories at that time, and I'm talking about, I think, 88-ish, was the highest building in the world at the time. And Pulitzer did it on purpose because all the other papers are surrounding it. They're all in that area. So he literally wanted to say, look, I'm bigger, I'm better than all of you. They were very competitive. So the circulation at the time was 250,000 daily. So to put that in perspective, it required 6 acres of spruce trees a day just to make the paper to print, for newsprint. I mean, that's how big it was. Speaking of big, it was also the era of the really large mustache. So, I mean, really, those are some big mustaches. So it was also a time of cutthroat journalism in New York City, which meant that newspapers were battling for readers at any cost. So think about undercover, think about vivid storytelling. They're all competing for the same readers. And so they're doing some really colorful things back at that time. And she knew when she walked into the World again that she could exploit this, that she could make it work for her. She presented the managing editor, John Cockrell, that's him in the middle, with a list of story ideas she was willing to pursue. Now remember, she's already seen him earlier and he said, no, we already have one woman on staff, we don't need another one, no thank you. So she knows that she's got one last shot because she's probably not gonna be allowed into his office anymore. So what she did is present him with a list of story ideas, all requiring some form of dangerous subterfuge that would make for vivid storytelling. They all required her to pretend someone that she was not. She knew she needed a job, and this was her last chance to get one, and it was the World that she most wanted to work for. So he looked at her, he smiled, and he said, come back in 2 weeks, here's $25, don't go anywhere else with your list. And the reason he said that was because she had made very daintily phrased threats that she was gonna go to other competitive papers with her list if he didn't give her an option, if he didn't let her write one of those stories. So she returns in 2 weeks, and this is what Cockrell posed, and I think most of you probably know this by now. He said that she needed to feign insanity to get committed to the Women's Insane Asylum on Blackwell's Island. Has anyone ever been to Roosevelt Island off the coast? Okay. Roosevelt Island is Blackwell's Island. So Blackwell's Island got a facelift in the 1970s and they renamed it Roosevelt Island. And today there are several bridges going over to it. It's absolutely beautiful. There's a cable tram that holds 20 people that comes up over that you can get to. It's absolutely beautiful. The condos there are like in the millions. It has an amazing view of the East River and the Manhattan skyline. So that's today. But In the Blackwell's Island days, it wasn't at all like that. It was like the place of no return. And she knew this when he gave her that story idea. And she said to him, but how will I get in? And he said, I don't know, you're the reporter, you figure it out. And she said, well, how will I get out? And he said, we'll figure it out, we'll let you know. So yeah, he was that nebulous and that just sort of indifferent to it. But remember, she's desperate because she doesn't want to go back to New York and she's out of money and they're behind on their rent. And so with those nebulous responses, she accepted. She was 23 years old. Blackwell's Island. She would stay 10 days at the asylum, which was the agreed upon time. But she decided before she got over there that she wanted to drop her show of insanity as soon as she crossed the threshold because she just wanted to see what would happen. Now, she's dropping her show of insanity, but she's still not telling anybody who she really is. So she's pretending to be an amnesiac, but she's telling them, that I'm really sane. In fact, she would say, quote, the more I endeavored to ensure the doctors of my sanity, the more they doubted it. So it was an absolutely horrendous experience that would stay with her for the rest of her life. I'm going to pass around another book. Oh, by the way, I forgot to pass around this book. It's another biography about Joseph Pulitzer. I could have wrote another book just about him. He was a fascinating character. This is one of the better biographies about him. There's all kinds of stuff in there, not just about the world, but about the kind of person that he was and how he managed his fortune, because he was a poor immigrant Hungarian Jew when he came over, and he became this very venerated publisher of more than one newspaper, and one would also go on to do a lot of groundbreaking things. So this is another book that I used for my research. It's by Stacey Horn called Damnation Island. Poor, sick, mad, and criminal in 19th century New York. I think this one also has pictures. No, it does not. But the cover of it has a photo of what Blackwell's Island would have looked like in Nellie's day. I think it was maybe taken a decade or so after. But it kind of gives you an idea of everything that was on the island. And what was on the island? There was a prison for men. There were almshouses, workhouses, a charity hospital, and the women's insane asylum. Originally, the asylum was for men and women, but it became so overcrowded that they moved the men to another island called Ward's Island, and so it would eventually become just an insane asylum for women. These were all public-run institutions with low budgets that were notoriously overcrowded with people and understaffed. Not a good combination. So when you mentioned Blackwell's Island in conversation back then, it was synonymous with hell. If you were going over there, you probably weren't coming back. So let me see, I'm gonna make sure I got everything in. Yes, so one final word about this. The world sent an attorney to fetch her as promised, never breathing a word of who she really was. They wanted to make sure she was safely off the island before the news broke, because they didn't want any problems with that. The write-up she produced was published with her byline, again, byline, the first for a female journalist writing for the world, in 2 Sunday installments. It was a huge success, and it put her on the map nationally, because not only did the world talk about it, but all the other papers in New York City were talking about it as well. How could this woman have duped so many doctors? The world hired her on the spot after that. The paper sold so many copies, Cockrell, the managing editor, said, you know what, you should reprint this into a book. And she decided to do it, and it was a nice little tidy income for her for years. She called it 10 Days in a Madhouse, and that is the original cover of what it looked like. The Historical Society in Apollo has one, and I got to touch it. This is my dog-eared copy that was available on Amazon through print on demand. Obviously, it does not have the sexy cover that does. I'm going to pass this around. It's a mess. I have all kinds of pages and dog-eared pages and highlights and all kinds of notes in there. But it gives you an idea of how long her installments were. Back then, newspapers had like 8 columns across of tiny little mouse print, and she took up a whole page, that first installment, and another whole page, that second installment. The only thing that book doesn't have, that her book also didn't have, I don't think her book had it, were illustrations that were printed in the newspaper at the time that were showing like the various doctors and things on the grounds and things like that. But all of this came at a huge cost because she would say later, I left those women in their living grave. So Nellie's asylum story is what I decided to write about because, and I'm not going to say too much about it, I couldn't believe when I found the story that no one had written a fictionalized novel about it. And it had been over 100 years, so chances are nobody was going to do it, so I thought that I would do it. But the question that I get a lot, and it was a question that I asked myself, was, well, if Nellie's already written the account of what happened, why would you write a novel about it? Like we already have her words. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to be able to put things in there to sort of put the meat on the bones and describe like who she was, if there was anything interesting that I could find. Well, when I read 10 Days in a Madhouse, I had a lot of questions about who she was. There's nothing really personal in there. I didn't know if she was married. I didn't know where she had come from. How would she be so desperate at 23 years old to go to a mental asylum where if the managing editor, who was the only other person who knew what she was doing, got run over, she probably would have never even been let out. So all of those questions were what fed my research. And what I found was there was a lot of stuff going on in her life that she never talked about. Some of it was secret. She didn't want anybody to know. And I was like, I want to put that in there. That's awesome. And then some other things that just didn't make sense for her to put in the newspaper article that I wanted to add because I thought it would, again, kind of further, build on the story of who she was. So that's it about that. So if anybody has ever heard of Nellie Bly before, what they usually know is that she went around the world. Has anybody heard about Nellie Bly going around the world ever? Okay, you knew about it? Okay, so usually when I was writing the book, I'd be like, hey, I'm writing a book about Nellie Bly. Have you ever heard of her? No. When I did get a yes, it was usually, oh yeah, didn't she go around the world or something like that? So this was the thing that she most became famous for. So in 1889, so we're talking about a little over a year after she got back from the asylum, she set out east from New York to prove that she could circumnavigate the globe in less time than the fictional Phileas Fogg and Jules Verne's well-known Around the World in 80 Days. Have you heard about Around the World in 80 Days? Okay, that I feel like a lot of people know. Now, one thing that really astonished me about this was that she's trying to beat the record of a fictional character in a novel. So she's really the only person that's ever really tried to do this before. Not just as a woman, but anybody. Like no one's ever done this. Okay, so here comes another plot twist. It wasn't until she arrived in Hong Kong that she learned Cosmopolitan magazine had sent a rival female reporter, Elizabeth Bisland, around the world in the opposite direction to beat her. The world was watching, and I say that not as an exaggeration. The paper's circulation absolutely soared. Everyone wanted to know where in the world Nellie Bly was on any given day. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone reading around the world, because what the other papers would do would copy verbatim what the New York World was printing about her into their own papers. And so there was this sort of exponential growth about what was going on, what in the world was going on. So it was a time, as I said, of great excitement. And I just want to say, are the volunteers here who printed out the Nellie Bly? Did you do that?
Well, some of my volunteers did.
Okay. I love it. I'm going to explain it. I wasn't going to mention it because I didn't think we had enough time, but I'm going to mention it now. So to keep up the excitement between her cabled reports, because remember, she's often on boats and in places where not a lot of people are. And so there would be breaks when nothing was happening and the world's like, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to talk about? They decided to run a contest who could guess Nellie's time in to New York down to the second. Other companies or other people got into the excitement by doing things like creating a Nellie Bly board game. I don't know how this worked. I think there's only a couple of games still existing. I've never put my hands on one before, but this is what the game board looked like. So people all over the world are playing the Nellie Bly game because they want to know who she is. So, the contest, and this is on the quiz, a prize would be awarded to the reader who could guess Bly's arrival down to the second. More than 500,000 readers around the world submitted ballots, and some people think that that's too low. There are other historians that think that the amount of ballots coming in was like closer to 1 million. So I don't really know what it is, but I'm just assuming at least 500,000. But that's still a lot of ballots coming in. There was so much mail coming in with these ballots, the world had to hire 3 extra full-time people just to bring all the mail in, open up the ballots, and log them in order. Bly arrived home, I've got it there on the screen, in 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds, beating the fictional Phileas Fogg by 8 days. Poor Elizabeth Bisland would arrive 4.5 days later. This is what the front page looked like when she got back. She's broken every record, Father Time outdone, even imagination's record pales before the performance of the world's globetrotter. Thousands cheer themselves hoarse at Bly's arrival. So this was on the front cover. So while a lot of people might have been cheering her on, hoarse, according to the paper, she felt that the world's own response was lukewarm. And she would say later, you know, nobody from the world even thanked me. She was gone for over 2 months. She was hurrying so that she could beat her rival, and she's absolutely exhausted, and she didn't even get a thank you. So she left. She decided to go on a 6-month lecture tour, which went very well. Unfortunately, at that time, her favorite brother died, Charles, and which launched her into a depression. And when she got better and felt like she could write again, she decided to begin writing serialized fiction for big money. Does anybody want to guess how much money she was making from serialized fiction for the New York Family Story paper, her yearly salary? 1,000? $10,000, which in today's money would have been $285,000. So she did well after she left. Here comes another plot twist. Marriage with an exclamation mark. Why a plot twist? She would tell her readers over and over that she would never marry. She said, I just don't have the temperament for it. I want to keep on working. I don't want to stay at home. I'll just never marry. So it was a shock in April of 1885 that she eloped with Robert Livingston Seaman, an industrialist worth a reported $3 million. So apparently she's going to make concessions for a millionaire. I don't blame her. He was nearly 40 years her senior, and they had only known one another for 2 weeks. So how do you think this is going to go, right? So, what was that? Oh, sorry.
She thought she saw his bank account.
She probably did. That first year was very rocky. She felt like someone had been following her for weeks after they got married. And one day she was fed up. She got in her carriage, another carriage pulled out behind her. She's like, I'm going to figure out who this is. So she decides to go to the nearest police station. She said, directs her driver, go to the nearest police station. The carriage arrives there. The other carriage is following her, is right behind her. She's mad. She jumps right out, and she's right in the driver's face, and she says, who are you? Who hired you to follow me? And he said, your husband. So he had been thinking that she was cheating on him because she was gone all the time, that her excuses of working weren't really working. And of course, she wasn't cheating on him. She just really, really worked hard for what she did. So that first year was very rocky. I would have not have wanted to have been him when she got home that day, for sure. So let's see, where was I? So after that, the marriage was much more harmonious, but when his eyesight began to fade, because again, he's quite a bit older than she is, they decided to go to Europe and spend time consulting specialists and cures. But in the spring of 1904, after just 9 years of marriage, Robert Seaman died at the age of 80. So this is when her life really starts to take a change from writing, and she starts doing very different things. We're going to talk about the Ironclad Manufacturing Company. Bly inherited Seaman's fortune and now resided over his business, the Ironclad Manufacturing Company. It was founded by Seaman and his partner in 1869, and the first thing that they made were these milk containers for transport by train. So think about these sort of short, stocky containers with really flat bottoms that wouldn't tip over in train transport. So after his death, from the start, she started working 11 to 12-hour days at the company's location in Brooklyn, and that's kind of a bird's eye view of the company, often bringing work home. She learned how to, among other things, operate every machine and design new ones. She streamlined processes, erected new buildings, discarded steam in favor of electricity, and expanded Ironclad's product offering to include, among other things, dairy supplies, boilers, hot water heaters, even kitchen sinks. All told, she would hold 25 patents in her name. That middle illustration is a copy of one of her patents. And if you look down, it's for a milk can, it says at the top. And if you look down, she is an inventor. She signed her name Elizabeth Cochran Seaman. So she would have 24 of those. So my favorite part about the Ironclad Manufacturing Company was that she made great strides as a social benefactress. She loves people, and she treated the company's 1,500 employees like family. She instituted weekly wages for every employee instead of paying them by piece. She built a recreation center, a gymnasium, a bowling alley, and a library on the company grounds. She provided entertainment for the workers on Saturday nights. And one thing I forgot to mention is that she also instituted paid vacation, which was pretty unusual for that time. I'm not sure how much vacation people got, but just the fact that I got paid vacation was pretty big. So for a time, she was one of the leading female industrialists in the US. This would have been he died in 1904, so this would have been 1904 on, and it would go on for several years. Now, here's the bad news. She had her finger in every pie except the accounting one. Her husband had a very loyal accountant who was a general manager named Edward Gilman. I'll show you his picture in a minute, whom her husband trusted. And because her husband had trusted him so much, she trusted him. She felt that she didn't have any affinity for accounting, and so she left everything to him. And it was all about to come crashing down. Even though the company appeared to be doing well, she would say, quote, "There never seemed to be enough money on hand." Starting in 1909, she began to suspect something wasn't right. So there's your year, it's 1909. So she's been doing this for about 5 years at this point. Things worsened in 1910 when Gilman, pictured there, grew ill and was hospitalized with stomach cancer and later died. Unfortunately, we know dead men tell no tales. Not long after, a fire broke out in the factory, causing $30,000 worth of damage, which was about $815,000 worth of damage. And then checks began to bounce. An auditor she had hired told her, "Mrs. Seaman, you have been surrounded by lots of rogues and scoundrels. The biggest one of them, Gilman, you have been robbed right and left." This is the only picture that I could find of him. I don't know what's going on with his left eye, but I decided to leave it because he's the villain on this slide, and we're just going to let that go. Blythe soon was embroiled in litigation that is difficult to follow today because there were so many shady characters, bookkeeping, and dishonesty involved. After unraveling some of the entries, the auditor revealed that her company had paid for, among other things, Gilman's personal yacht for $30,000 or $815,000 today. Can you imagine? And he's dead. She can't even It was the tip of the iceberg. 3 company cashiers confessed to Blythe that they had forged company checks with her signature. One of them fled to Germany. The 2 others were arrested for larceny. In spite of their confessions to Blythe, they pled not guilty at trial. It was estimated that money lost to theft was a whopping, I think I put this on the slide. No, I didn't. Was a whopping $400,000, which in today's money was about $10 million. Creditors filed a petition for involuntary bankruptcy, and a U.S. bankruptcy commissioner appointed a company receiver, and he took possession of the plant the next day. She's absolutely devastated, not so much for herself, but for those employees, because she treated them like family, and they felt like family. So from that point onward, Bly acted to keep the company open for sales. She would say, there's enough open orders today to get us back into insolvency. If you'll just let the employees and me back in, we can correct this, we can do it. But they wouldn't do it. So she wasn't able to do that. And again, she hated the idea of putting these employees out of work. So in March of 1913, 2 years after the company cashiers had been arrested, the case came before the New York Supreme Court. After a week of proceedings, the jury was unable to reach a verdict. The cashiers were released. Bly's dreams of saving the ironclad manufacturing company were dashed. She lost most of the fortune that she had inherited in this, and she was bitterly disappointed, exhausted, and broke. So, what do you do when something like this happens? You decide to take a vacation, a much needed vacation, because those court cases had gone on for years and they had really worn her down. And by this time, she is a matronly 50-year-old who needed rest. So she set sail for Europe the following summer to visit a friend for 2 weeks. Okay, so remember 2 weeks. Can you sense a plot twist coming? Because there is always one in her life. Halfway there was the outbreak of World War I. It left the ship's destination unknown. So they're literally on the water and they don't know where to go. The ship would eventually dock, and she made her way to Paris and then on to Vienna, which is where she had wanted to go in the first place. And she registered at the US Embassy. She billeted at the Hotel Imperial, pictured there where a lot of dignitaries stayed. But she was now stuck in Vienna because all of the passages back to the United States, all of the sales were booked until October. So she can't go anywhere and she can't really do anything. So as usual, when life gave her lemons, she decided to make lemonade, and she decided to become a war correspondent. Because, you know, why not? If you can't go on vacation, why not become a correspondent? She was able to get passage to the front, where the Australian forces were dealing with Russians to the north. Bly was one of only 4 correspondents who was allowed to do this, and she was the only woman. Arthur Brisbane, who's pictured there, by the way, Pulitzer's wife had an affair with him. Something that I learned in the Pulitzer book. Arthur Brisbane, who was her longtime friend and editor of the New York Evening Journal, was happy to print her articles and her coverage of the war. So her first cable to him read, "I will send 3 articles. I go to the firing line, get up a movement among your readers to send packages of cotton by parcel post to the Red Cross, War Department, care of Vienna. Poor wounded soldiers suffering. Yours, Nellie Bly." She was appalled at the filth and described the look of wounded soldiers this way. "Sometimes they saluted, more often they staggered unconsciously and forlornly on, their sunken eyes fixed pathetically to the west. Blind to their surroundings, their ears deaf to the near and ceaseless thundering of cannons, their nerves dead." She would actually be in the trenches with them sometimes. And there are stories, I don't know if they're true or not. Remember, she had left to go for 2 weeks. So she's packing dresses and furs. And there's a story of her in fur, wearing fur in the trenches for World War. I was amazed by that. But she lost her objectivity because she was such a bleeding heart. So after a few years, after a few years of covering the war, Bly remained in Vienna, shifting her focus from war correspondent to advocate of the Australian war effort. She joined an organization to raise money for charitable work, such as the arrangement of orphan adoptions and providing medical and financial aid for families of soldiers. She was particularly interested in helping out widows of the war and orphans of the war. She always had a soft spot for orphans, always, and there's more about that later in her life. She used her influence to encourage Americans to send money and relief supplies. The US was still officially neutral in the war, but Bly had lost her journalistic objectivity, as I said. She wanted to improve lives and minimize hardship, and she was especially sensitive to the plight of widows and orphans. In 1917, the US finally entered the war alongside Britain, France, and Russia, and she would return home after 3+ years being over there. So that was a long vacation that wasn't so much a vacation. So she comes home, she doesn't have any savings, she's lost her brownstone in the ironclad debacle, she doesn't have any money, she doesn't even have furnishings. So she needs a job. So she calls on Brisbane again, the man that was on the last slide, who was still the editor of the journal, and he offered her a position as an editorial columnist for $100 a week. Now this was way lower than what she was used to getting, but she didn't have much of a choice. So Brisbane allowed her free reign over her topics, which is what she did best. Readers wrote her about all manner of things that she ended up putting into print. And this is one of those slow building plot twists. Soon, her work morphed into an advice column, reinforced when a woman wrote in with financial trouble, asking Bly if she should give up her 2-year-old baby. Bly cautioned her against it, but went further by promising to find work for the mother near an affordable daycare center. I have to imagine at this time, in the early 1900s, they didn't have a lot in the way of daycare centers. And it was the start of something big. So by this time, Bly has made her temporary home at that hotel. That's the Hotel McAlpin. She started out with just a couple of rooms, because that was all the space that she needed. But when she started her column under Brisbane for the Journal, she needed more room because she started getting in, again, all this fan mail from people. And so her 2 rooms became 3, became 4. I think at one time she was almost an entire floor because of all the fan mail that she got. And she had to hire all these secretaries to go through and log all her various correspondence. Without attempting outright to do it, here comes the plot twist, her work, by way of her column, had grown into an impromptu agency for helping orphans and abandoned babies find good homes. So by 1920, Bly was really busy. She's already writing 2 columns a week for the Journal, in addition to her adoption work. And that adoption work was a lot of work for her because she wanted to make sure these babies were going to right homes. It wreaked havoc on her health. The overexertion from being the war correspondent years before had spilled over into her life in New York. She ate sporadically and suffered from bronchitis quite a lot, which would lead often to hospital stays. So, still, the amount of work Bly produced in 1921 at age 57 was as great as any in her young years as a star reporter. So she's slowing down physically, but she's keeping at it mentally. But it would all come at a cost. So Brooke Kruger writes in her biography, she neglected her health. She refused to take prescribed medication, ran around in the worst weather in taxi cabs, skipped meals often, and ate only sporadically when she bothered to eat. So this is at the time, close to the end of her life, when the letter comes into play. So that is a copy of the letter that John wasn't nice enough to send me. So around this time, she received a letter from a gentleman connected to your museum, which he has already told you about. He wrote under the pseudonym, as he said, of Jedediah Tingle, but he said the man, quote, has been dead 100 years. So he was very cloak and dagger about who he was. He never told her in the letter who he really was. And I've heard of Jedediah Tingle, right? Even if you don't know much, have you heard of, heard Jedediah Tingle? Okay, so there's some about that. So in the letter, he donates $5 for Nellie's Sailor Boys. And I'm just going to read the letter for you quickly here. I'm going to put on my glasses for a second. So it's addressed, Miss Nellie Bly. I'm enclosing $5 for your Sailor Boys. Use it as you wish. I have followed your career since the days when you encompassed the world in competition with Jules Verne's fictitious hero. Your heart has always been in the right place. However, much of your logic has shot amiss. Don't criticize ship owners for not employing Americans when to do so under the federal law means to go broke. The sailors can go broke as a consequence of the inability of the owners to make ends meet. Your sob stop is all to the good, without violating the inexorable laws of economics. The undersigned cannot be reached, for he has been dead 100 years. Only his bank account is alive. The identity of the impersonal personality that directs gifts such as these, and there are many, is beyond detection, even at the hands of one of our most brilliant columnists, Nellie Bly. I read this and thought, well, this is kind of a kiss slap, right? Like he's saying on the one hand, wow, you're so noble, I love you, you're doing all the great things, but your logic is flawed. So I didn't know much about what this letter was about, because I read Brooks' biography, but I had read it years ago, and I didn't remember much about the, quote, sailor boys. So I went down the rabbit hole with research. And just as some background, in 1921, there was a recession going on in the shipping industry that left 20,000 Americans jobless. This was compounded by the U.S.-owned ships hiring cheaper labor of foreign crewmen. Well, Nellie found that out, and she just thought it was outrageous. She thought it was un-American, and she felt sorry. Again, she's a bleeding heart. She wants these people to have good work. So she started an association called the American Seamen's Association, which she became the president of. And their aim was to, quote, establish American seamen exclusively upon American boats to defend the rights of American seamen and to expose injustices and wrongs done them and to aid them in every way toward their betterment and supremacy. So essentially, Tingle is saying, here's $5 to the effort, and while all this is noble, it's economically unsound. So Bly, because she's Bly, would reply, and that's her letter. I'll read it in a minute. Note that it's on McAlpin Stationery, Hotel McAlpin Stationery, because that's where she was living at the time. Mr. Jedediah Tingle, I want to thank you on behalf of the starving American seamen for your kind contribution. I know you will be happy to realize that I have been able to feed 25 men for an entire day on the amount you sent. That constituted 3 meals. Can you imagine 3 meals? 25 people for only $5? Okay, and if you could have seen the happiness on those hungry boys as they ate, you would indeed have been repaid for your thoughtful generosity. I have not succeeded in finding any building to rent which comes within my means, but I have asked for a ship from Mr. Lasker, I don't know who that is, and I have also written the mayor asking if he could not designate some building for this use. The nights are not only cold, but we are having a great deal of wet weather, and it is a terrible thing for many hundreds of native-born Americans to be compelled to sleep out in the parks and in any dark corner where they can crawl. Thanking you again for your kindness. Believe me, very sincerely yours, Nellie Bly. And then she signed it, the president of the American Seamen's Association. So she thanks him, but shows frustration over the lack of finding affordable housing for all of these men because of this recession in the shipping industry. So Tingle would go on to write 2 more letters, and I'm going to pass around the packet of the first 2 that I read and then the other 2 that Tingle sent. But as far as I know, she didn't reply to them, and if she did, the letters haven't survived. But one of the reasons perhaps that the letters didn't survive is that she didn't have much longer to live. Bly wrote her last newspaper column in January of 1922. The day it ran, she was admitted to the hospital with an acute case of bronchopneumonia, complicated by heart disease. The headline of her column was eerily relevant, Nellie Bly on Pranks of Destiny. She signed her will while hospitalized, though she had little money to leave her heirs. Her heirs at this point are her youngest brother, Harry, and the niece of her deceased sister, Kate. Death came a few weeks later on January the 27th, 1922. She was just 57. The newspapers gave notice of her passing, and her obituary ran over the wires of the Associated Press. One of the things I found interesting was that, and you probably remember this from the quiz, she lied about her age. So when all these obituaries came out, they all had these different ages listed. She was 57, but if you look really closely at that picture, it says that she was 56. I thought that was kind of amusing. The New York World, the paper that made her famous, ran a long story illustrating the highlights of her wondrous life. Perhaps the best epitaph are the words she'd written in her column the previous summer. To be happy, to know how to find happiness under all circumstances, is the acme of wisdom and the triumph of genius. I have one more slide, I promise, just one more. So this is my shameless author plug. A Feigned Madness and Arsenic Eater's Wife are my books. They're for sale here today. There's absolutely no pressure for you to buy. But if you are interested, feel free to come on up to the table and I'd be happy to sign them. FYI, The Arsenic Eater's Wife has nothing to do with Nellie Bly. It's a completely different case. It's about another woman I pulled from the pages of history in the late 1880s who gets she gets tried for poisoning her husband to death with arsenic. And it was another one of those things that nobody had written about, and I couldn't really believe it. So I decided to write the book myself. So that's it. So now we can talk about who won the quiz for a free book. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Tanya. We're going to have to grade on a curve, folks. The high score was 5 out of 10. According to my crack teaching assistants over here, one person had 5 correct, 8 people had 4 correct, 9 had 3 correct, 10 had 2, 5 had 1, and somebody didn't sign their name on the paper. Okay. And the high score goes to Liz G.
Cool.
Does anybody have any questions for Tanya? Oh, you want the answers? Okay, that's a good, excellent point. Okay, what was her childhood nickname?
Pinky.
Pinky, yes.
Her mother dressed her in these outrageously expensive pink dresses, and she was all about that. She loved it.
Why did Nellie change the spelling of her name from Cochran with no E on the end to Cochran with an E on the end? Want me to
Yeah.
Okay. To distance herself from the tumultuous years of her hometown in Apollo. How many years did Nellie trim off her age for her passport in 1888? 3. What exotic animal did Nellie return home after her round-the-world trip? A monkey.
His name was McGinty. She loved him.
What was the grand prize in New York World offered to the person who guessed Nellie's race time down to the second? A trip to Europe with spending money. That's pretty good.
It was a lot of money. I want to say it was like $1,000. So it was like many thousands of dollars in spending money. It was a good gift. It was a pretty good prize.
What was the name of the novel Nellie wrote in 1888? The Mystery of Central Park. Nellie was among just 2 other female reporters at Joseph Pulitzer's funeral. That is false.
She was the only female at his reporter at his funeral.
What item did Nellie have that was once owned by Queen Victoria? A brooch. What was Nellie Bly once arrested for? Failing to produce documents in court. And finally, sadly, Nellie was buried in an unmarked grave for how many years? 50 years. Where is she buried?
She is buried in New York. I don't know the name of the cemetery. It's I can't think of the name.
Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Woodlawn.
Awesome.
Famous.
Thank you.
Spring Grove.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you just look that up, or did you know that?
Oh no,
He lives in New York.
I live nearby.
And you just happen to know that Nellie Bly?
Yeah, they give tours and then there's a few things. There. Nellie Bly, Bat Masterson.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
gunman and correspondent, newspaperman. He wrote newspapers, sports for newspapers. You know.
So Nellie Bly is in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Same cemetery as Bat Masterson. Questions, ladies and gentlemen. Anybody have any questions? I'm sorry?
No, I think it's, why was it unmarked?
Why was it unmarked?
I think because she died without enough money to have like a marker. And it wasn't until many years later, I'm not even sure how many years later, that people were like, we really need to put a marker on her grave for what she did. So it's sad. It's tragic. I mean,
Yeah.
even going 5 years was a lot, but 50, that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Any other questions?
The audio guy, right? Did you? Oh, no, I thought you had your hand up.
What did you do before you started writing these books?
What did you do before you started writing books?
I had a degree in journalism, but when I interviewed for jobs and they wanted to pay me like under the poverty level, I was like, I also had a degree in business, and I decided to do that and go into marketing, and so that's what I did. So I eventually ended up working with a lot of consumer packaged goods companies and being like a brand manager or a product manager. So I worked for Hillshire Farm and Cons here when it was here. I worked for Hasbro when it was here. I worked for a company up in Vandalia called The First Years on baby products. And in Boston, when we moved to Boston, I worked for another baby product company there. So I did a lot of marketing. I did, if anybody needed any writing done, I was like, I'll do it, because I like to write a lot. But I always knew that I wanted to write. It just was a matter of finding the right time. But then, you have a family, you have young kids. I started To Fame Madness in 2014, and it took me 5 years to write it. And it is true that the first book that you write will be the only one that you write without a deadline, because you don't have a publisher yet. So but I had to take my time, because we had 3 young boys that were still in grade school at the time. And I remember they would always ask me, why is it taking you so long to write your book? You've just been writing it forever. And I'd look at them and go, because of you. That's why. I never had more than maybe an hour at a time, it seemed like, to get it down. Plus I had all the research, and I ended up going to New York City to see. I went to the island, and I went to Pittsburgh too, because there were some handwritten letters by Nellie. She became close to Erasmus Wilson, the man that she hated for his women's sphere. Women only belong in the home. He became more like a father to her, as it turned out. And they had a series of letters going back and forth. And I found a really good detail in the handwritten letter at Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh that I ended up putting in the book, which changed the whole outlook. It was phenomenal. I'm so glad I went there to do it. So anyway, that was a long answer. Marketing, business.
I know she was very close to the brother who died. What about the other 3?
The other
Children,
Children?
siblings.
Yeah, she didn't really have a relationship with the 10. She was very close. She was probably closest to her younger sister. It was 2 brothers. Nellie was in the middle, and then Kate, her other sister. She was very close to her. And when she died early, another thing I didn't have time to put in, she ended up going to, the Siemens had a property in the Catskills, and she went to the Catskills. She got all of her sister's belongings, and she lit them aflame because she was so angry that she had died. I think she died of tuberculosis. I'm not quite sure, but she had a really hard time with that. But interestingly, her oldest brother Albert, who was probably more like her than any of the other siblings, she did not get along with at all. And at the time of her death, those 2 were estranged, very estranged. He had access to her brownstone when she covered for the war, and he sold all her furnishings out from under her. So when she got back, she didn't have any furniture left. And then, of course, the bank came for her brownstone. So she hated Albert. She did not like him. That's in the book too. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tanya. Folks, thanks for coming. Tanya will be signing her books and selling her books over there. Please remember that the Harmon Museum is free for you to explore today, and there's also a discount at our gift shop. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.